so happy to have you here. My name is Amy Zenger. I'm the current director of the Center for American Studies and Research, and we're very glad that you're here. This is our first event of the semester, and we're very happy to welcome Martin Puchner for not only a talk tonight, but also another talk tomorrow night. So we're very generous in that. So I'll tell you a little bit more about it later. And before I introduce our guests, I'd like to just let you know a little bit about some of the upcoming events so that you can have them on your radar when we make our announcements. We're actually hosting 2 people next week. Joshua Mitchell will be speaking on the moving image in carceral spaces, introducing television to the American prison. We're also hearing from Ina Tyagi. She's done some very innovative work on visuality and technology in relation to the petroleum industry. So Carol Fadda-Conry will be talking about narrative depictions and experiences of incarcerated Arabs and Muslims.
When is she coming?
February 19th. So soon. All of these will be announced. I'm just giving a brief preview. We'll be hosting a symposium for regional American Studies scholars in March called Localizing Transnational American Studies. We're looking at sort of American studies from the outside, if you will. And we'll also have a conference on Latin America, Al-Andalus, and the Arab world, which will include a theatrical performance and quite a broad range of different, across several disciplines. So, we're very excited and fortunate to have with us this evening Professor Puchner, and he's the Byron and Anita Bean Professor of Drama and English and Comparative Literature at Harvard University. His prize-winning books cover subjects from philosophy to the arts, and his best-selling Norton Anthology of World Literature, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and his Harvard X MOOC, the massive open online course, have brought 4,000 years of literature to students across the globe. So this is his most recent book, and I really wanted to show it in person because it's very beautiful. I've been looking at it, and it's a wonderfully generous book. It's a book that incorporates travel and contextualizes literature and makes it very, it's both very scholarly, but also generous in the sense of presenting it to everyone. People will enjoy that. So, Dr. Puchner is the director of Harvard's program in theater, dance, and media, so he'll be discussing that work tomorrow at 5 in Auditorium A in West Hall.
A or B? B.
Oh, B?
B.
Sorry.
This is
Auditorium B. The theater room. Sorry.
Second.
Luckily you're here. So that will be very interesting and quite different. So it's about theater experiments and sort of the formation of the program in theater, dance, and media at Harvard. So tonight, however, he's speaking on world literature. So please welcome Professor Puchner, who's speaking on Benjamin Franklin, media entrepreneur and the Republic of Letters. Thank you so much.
Thank you all, and it's great to be back. I was here maybe 4 years ago or 5 years ago, and it's wonderful to be here. On August 2nd, 1776, the members of the Second Continental Congress gathered to sign the Declaration of Independence. The young Thomas Jefferson had drafted the text on a custom-made lap desk and sent it to the Congress, where it was put to table, which meant that it was put on a table where each member could amend it or write comments and suggestions. After the Congress had agreed and voted on the revised document, it was ceremoniously read aloud by Colonel John Nixon on July 8. Several weeks later, the Congress hired Timothy Matlack, a former beer brewer who also excelled at the elegant English roundhand with its open, flowing script. Using a feather quill pen, Matlack wrote out the entire declaration on a single page of parchment, leaving the bottom fifth free for the required signatures. One by one, the members of the Congress stepped forward to sign. Benjamin Franklin waited for his turn after about half the signatures had been applied, approached and signed the document with a graceful hand, styling himself Benj Franklin. Most signatories simply put down their name, but Franklin took the liberty of adding an elaborate flourish underneath the length of his signature, drawing a long figure 8, then a smaller round circle across it, and finishing off with another figure 8. Perhaps he felt that he had saved room for this extravagance by abbreviating his first name. So this is sort of the opening scene, and want to pause here for a second, because I think that as Franklin's quill scratched across the parchment bearing the Declaration of Independence, he must have realized just how antiquated it all was in 1776 to sign a document handwritten by a scribe and on parchment. In the book that was just shown, The Written World, I tried to give a kind of synoptic view of 4,000 years of literature. And the through line, the main argument of the book, is that I define literature as the intersection of storytelling and writing technologies. I begin with the invention of writing, not that far from here in Mesopotamia. And so I look at different intersections when new writing technologies, such as the alphabet, paper, and print, and I'm going to talk about all three of them, especially the latter, lead to changes in writing culture, lead to new forms and formats of literature from the beginning of literature to our present day. And this emphasis on writing and technologies is very much taken before the background of this experience we all share, namely that we are living through this revolution in writing technologies, when new technologies changing how we communicate with written words, through the internet. And I think we can all sense that this is a profound shift that's changing not just forms of communication, but also storytelling. So the book is an attempt to look at these earlier moments, to look at what happens when new technologies come along and how they change the kinds of stories we tell. And I start with the earliest epics, such as the Epic of Gilgamesh. I move on to the invention of Holy Scripture, that some of these written stories were seen as sacred. This is something that didn't happen immediately, that, like all things, had to be invented. I look at the way in which new technologies lower the cost of literature and start a kind of democratizing process where literature is no longer just in the hands of a small number of scribes, but lead to more popular forms of storytelling. One example is, in the Arabic world, the story collection, 1001 Nights, all the way to print. So Franklin plays an important role for me here, but not because of what I just started, namely the Declaration of Independence written on parchment. I talk a little bit about how parchment was developed at the Library of Pergamon in what's now Asia Minor, Turkey, I mean, it's still Asia Minor, in Turkey, where the librarians started to compete with the Library of Alexandria, but wanted to be independent of the writing material that was powering the written world at the time, namely papyrus. So they developed or perfected really the technique of stretching animal skin and turning that into parchment, pergamentum in Latin, named after that library. So this one technology Franklin was using in 1776, parchment, comes from that library. And of course he was writing it in the alphabet, and the alphabet has an even more closer local connection because the alphabet was really in its full form, invented by Phoenicians and exported to Turkey. So lots of local connection in this broad story about different technologies which by 1776 are outdated. And Franklin is the person to know it because he is the one who perfected the latest technologies in writing at the time and turned it into a kind of media empire. And so I want to talk a little bit about the components of these new technologies and how Benjamin Franklin really, over the course of his career, controlled them all in single-handedly. In fact, the Declaration of Independence, though it started in this old-timey way with a handwritten scribe on parchment, actually is a good illustration of these new technologies. As soon as the Declaration was voted into existence on July 4, a full month before that beautiful handwritten copy that I just described was created, the signed and ratified text had been sent to a printer, John Dunlop, who had produced some 200 broadside copies overnight. The copies were immediately dispatched on horseback to the other 12 colonies on postal roads. On July 6, a newspaper, the Pennsylvania Evening Post, carried the Declaration on its front page. And on July 10, Mary Catherine Goddard did the same with the Maryland Journal, and many other newspapers followed. It was really not on parchment, but in the form of printed newspapers and broadsides that the United States first declared their independence from England. So let's track some of these technologies. Print, probably the most important one. And indeed, among all the framers of the Declaration, Franklin was in the best position to appreciate the role of print that day. Later, at the court of France, Marie Antoinette would disparage him for lacking in aristocratic refinement because he had been, as she put it, a printer's foreman. Now, though unkind, Marie Antoinette was not wrong. As you probably know, Franklin had learned the trade of printer as a quasi-indentured apprentice to his brother, who introduced him to every step in the printing process, including the making of inks, different types of paper, letters, and layout. The process hadn't significantly changed since Gutenberg, and Gutenberg's reinvention of print is important for me in the book more generally. Print was first developed in East Asia, in China, and the earliest surviving printed text in the world is from 868, so many centuries before Gutenberg. It's the Diamond Sutra, so another sacred text. And it's one of the patterns I see when looking at these 4,000 years of literature, that sacred texts are often, interestingly enough, early adopters of new technologies. Here, in the case of print, the Diamond Sutra, revolving around the life of the Buddha, developed, of course, in India, but then transported to China, where it uses print, and it's the oldest surviving printed text. The same thing happens when Gutenberg reinvents print in Northern Europe, and the first text he prints is the Latin Bible. So this is the quick story of print. It's kind of a global story, and it is in Gutenberg, it is in Northern Europe that print gets reinvented and then brought to the United States. The process hadn't really changed, but what had changed were the effects of print. Cheap, by the time of Franklin, cheap new formats, above all newspapers and broadsides, changed fundamentally how ideas spread. And this is, I think, where Franklin's contribution really lies. While he didn't fundamentally change the techniques of printing, he realized what could be done with print. And he spent his career perfecting and expanding the infrastructure of print. It is really, as a media entrepreneur, as I've said, that Franklin helped more than anyone to create the world that would bring the Declaration of Independence into being. Now, I should say that the New England into which Franklin was born took great pride in literacy, though it was a literacy based on a single book, namely the Bible, which the Puritans had brought from England, the Geneva Bible, the English Bible translated secretly and printed secretly in Geneva, Switzerland. Only 8 years after settling, they founded a college, which would become Harvard University, to ensure higher levels of literacy, and created schools in which both men and women were taught, young men and women were taught to read. They created what was at the time the most literate society on earth, with 45% of literacy among white women and 70% among white men. In 1790, the literacy rate among white men was an astonishing 19%. Literacy based on book. Franklin cared about books. He started one of the first public libraries, the Library Corporation. And once he became wealthy, he assembled one of the largest private collections at the time. But he, as a printer, never printed more than a couple of books because it was an expensive proposition demanding significant capital outlays. He imported books from England but didn't print them himself. What he printed instead was newspapers. And this is important here because when he was born, there existed only a single newspaper in the North American colonies. But Franklin's brother had challenged the status quo by starting his own newspaper, which put him on a collision course with the authorities. He was arrested. Benjamin Franklin, the young, still indentured Benjamin Franklin, continues the newspaper in his brother's stead, and he's introduced to the idea that there is a market for newspaper people didn't expect. There was room for more than one newspaper. In fact, that several newspapers, a town of a significant size, could use several newspapers which would debate ideas and controversy, and that newspapers would thrive on this kind of controversy. Once he realized that, he broke his contract, went from Boston to Philadelphia, and started out as a printer himself. And his career was really based on printing newspapers. The philosopher Hegel would compare the ritual reading of the morning paper to the morning prayer, an idea that Franklin would have liked. Having abandoned the Puritan faith of his fathers, he had opted for the Republican faith in the newspaper. So this is an important part of the newspapers, and it's of course on newspapers, as I said, that the Declaration of Independence gets distributed through the colonies. The other form, as I mentioned, are broadsides. And they were perhaps even more important. Shorter, cheaper, easier to distribute even than newspapers. Single-page broadsides consisted of one large folio-sized page that could be posted on walls or doors, or a page could be printed on both sides and folded once and twice, yielding 4 to 16 pages respectively, and you could combine some of these folded pages and create pamphlets of 48 pages that could be stitched together quite easily on the back with a needle. And these were cheap pamphlets, and a lot of the polemical political culture in the North American colonies was based on these so-called broadsides. So the significant print run of the Declaration of Independence in the form of a broadside was the culmination of decades of broadside publishing. So those were the two formats, if you will, that had come into existence through print and pioneered and to some extent controlled by Franklin himself. But since I mentioned parchment as the old-fashioned surface for this elegant version of the Declaration of Independence, I want to talk a little bit about an even more fundamental technology, namely paper. Because Franklin realized that it wasn't just enough to have a print shop as he did, he also needed control over the supply of the surface onto which material would be printed, namely paper. After failing to buy out a paper supplier from a Philadelphia rival, he helped other papermakers set up their own business and share profits. Paper was still made from rags, and Franklin himself collected rags and sent them to paper mills in the surrounding area that were part of his sphere of influence before then buying back the finished paper. He eventually extended his supply of paper all the way to the south, including a paper mill at Williamstown, which, like many Dutch mills that produced paper, exported to the colonies, was driven by windmills. So many of them were driven by water-based mills, some by windmills. So Franklin, in essence, was doing a kind of vertical integration, trying to control everything from the material out of which paper was made, namely rags, to the paper mills themselves, and then to print and the newspapers and broadsides that were produced. And paper plays a really important story in my book. I expected that the invention of print in China and the reinvention of print in Northern Europe would be important for the kind of a story of literature driven by technologies. I didn't expect paper to play an equal role, but it actually is. And again, it's a story that's interestingly linked to the Arabic world. Paper was developed first in China. The Diamond Sutra, the earliest surviving text that I mentioned, is printed on paper. And it is really in East Asia that paper first leads to a kind of explosion of literature, kind of golden age of medieval literature. But then paper gets introduced to the Arabic world. And there are actually dramatic stories about how this happens, stories that are probably not true, but stories that there is a war and Chinese prisoners of war are captured and the secret of papermaking is extracted from them. So I said the story is probably not true, but it shows how important paper was seen to be, and Baghdad becomes the center of papermaking. And it is really paper. And so in the Arabic world, also the technique of making paper out of rags, which is still important in Franklin's time, was developed. And that became this crucial papermaking ideal. A technique. And paper then really fuels the golden age of Arabic letters, and it leads to an explosion of popular literature like the Arabian Nights. The other thing that's interesting about paper in the Arabic world is that while papermaking is taken from China and really developed further in the Arabic world, print is not. There is no print that gets adopted from China. So in a sense, the Arabic world is a kind of great test case of the profound effects of paper, even without print. Then I follow the paper trail, as I call it, through Al-Andalus, Arab-occupied Spain, which is how it gets introduced to Northern Europe just in time for the other Chinese technique, namely print, to make it via the Silk Route to Northern Europe. And that's really what happens with Gutenberg, is that paper and print get recombined there, and this is what leads to the second great print revolution in Northern Europe, which then gets exported to the United States. So this is the story of paper and how paper becomes so crucial for the written world after the reinvention of print in Northern Europe, and which is why Franklin was so keen on having control over his paper supply. So here is Franklin sitting really at the center of this increasingly integrated media world, from paper and print all the way to newspapers. And he isn't content with a kind of vertical integration. He's also interested in horizontal integration. He sets up kind of a first franchise he lends money to relatives, to some of his sons, to acquaintances, to set up print shops and paper mills, and then shares in their profits. So he really kind of creates a network that reaches all the way to the Caribbean, including John Dunlop, who became the official printer of the Declaration of independence. So what I'm trying to suggest here is that he really controls the underlying technologies as much as the content of the Declaration of Independence. And there's one more. I mentioned that once it's printed in newspapers and broadsides, the Declaration of Independence gets transported by horseback to the other colonies, often within days, and it gets transported on postal roads. So now we're really getting deep into the weeds of the infrastructure of communication at the time. And again, Benjamin Franklin is key because he recognizes very early on the importance of infrastructure, and especially in governmental infrastructure. As soon as he has made a name for himself as a printer, he tries to get government contracts, which are very lucrative, including and especially for printing money. But there's one more important government franchise, and these are the government roads, the so-called postal roads on which mail is distributed. They are under the control of the postmaster. Now, the postmaster is a kind of honorary position. It doesn't come much in terms of salary, but it means that you can send items for free, and you can also say which of your rivals or associates can send items for free. So it was a crucial position for Franklin, and he worked very systematically to increase. First he becomes postmaster of Pennsylvania, and then he gets into his hands onto the postal roads of the other colonies until he becomes postmaster general of the colonies, and in 1775 switches his allegiance from the crown to become the first postmaster general appointed by the Second Continental Congress. He takes the job actually very seriously. Franklin always takes everything very seriously. He started to inspect these postal roads, and he found that they were not in good shape. He was shocked by the decrepit roads, drunken drivers and riders, and the lack of proper inns to stay at. But he was not easily deterred and decided to inspect all postal roads, traveling some 1,600 miles from Virginia to New England. He also made significant improvements, cutting down the time it would take for mail to get from Philadelphia to New York, namely a round trip in 24 hours. I think that's significantly shorter than what it takes today to send an item from one town in the United States to another. So, Franklin controlled not just the technologies that made the distribution of the Declaration of Independence possible, but also the infrastructure on which it relied. Now, all of this was a lot of work, and Franklin was a very busy man. But once he had made his fortune with all this infrastructure, communication infrastructure, he left the business of running to associates and became a man of leisure. That didn't mean that he took it easily, because now he turned himself into a scientist. He did all kinds of scientific experiments about electricity and made other contributions. What's interesting for our purposes here is that this new leisurely activity actually reveals another aspect of the world of print, of which he became such a champion, namely the philosophical societies and knowledge, what we might call knowledge network, with which these early natural philosophers, as they were called, and scientists exchanged ideas, creating a sort of new centers of knowledge that were independent of older institutions such as the church or royal courts. He himself founded the American Philosophical Society and helped set up scholarly journals with which knowledge would be distributed. So this is interesting because so far what I've described with these broadsides and newspapers was kind of a popular explosion of writing that happened through these new technologies. With these philosophical societies and scholarly societies a kind of more rarefied and elite form of exchange. He participated in this kind of elite form of exchange that was equally important. And he was one of the few people, I think, who really appreciated both of these sides. He knew that the Enlightenment was not just something connected to philosophers enjoying prestige and autonomy from established centers of power, but also the democratic cacophony of ideas created by newspapers and broadsides. Again, at the kind of pinnacle of these new forms of knowledge that were made possible by print were encyclopedias, because paper had lowered the cost of, and print had lowered the cost of producing these multi-volume encyclopedias enough so that at least some institutions and wealthy individuals could purchase them. And Franklin himself purchased some of these encyclopedias, published some in the newspapers, excerpts from them in the newspapers he owned, and was an advocate of this new form of knowledge production. So again, I think all of this is meant to resonate with our own moment, where we have new technologies creating new formats, including with encyclopedias. Wikipedia would be a good example. New forms of popular, more democratic access to reading and writing. Blogs would be an example. In addition to scholarly exchanges, and the internet was, of course, partially created for scholarly exchange in the sciences. So all of this is crucial for Franklin and really creates the conditions, if you will, for something like the Declaration of Independence to emerge. Now, I would say that all this technology really not just created the conditions for the Declaration of Independence, but also created the trigger for it. All that was needed was a match. Now, the conventional story about the American Revolution is that this match was the Boston Tea Party, right? The British had imposed taxes on the colonists, even though the colonists had no representation in Parliament. In protest, freedom-minded Bostonians, disguised as Indians, threw newly taxed tea into Boston Harbor. This is the standard story of how the revolution starts, and it's not untrue, but it is incomplete, because the first tax imposed on the colonists that triggered widespread resentment was not on tea, but on paper and printed matter, the so-called Stamp Act. In fact, despite Franklin and others' attempts to establish a domestic paper industry, most paper in the colonies was still imported, often on Dutch paper distributed by English wholesalers. This import was targeted on the Stamp Act, which required a tax, and the paper would be stamped to show that the tax had been paid. Now, I would say that it was probably not the smartest way for the British to raise taxes, because it targeted the burgeoning colonial publishing industry, which fought back with all its might. Newspapers ran front-page stories about the injustice of the Stamp Act. Some added black funereal frames. In one paper, printed a gravestone across the front page. Printers boycotted, protested, decried, and openly defied the tax by using paper that had not been stamped. So somehow the British, in their haplessness, had managed to target with their tax the part of the North American colonies that could make the most noise, namely precisely newspapers such as the one owned by Franklin. So this is why the British, realizing their mistake, tried to change the structure of the stamp tax, but still didn't get it right. And angry printers destroyed stamped paper publicly in a kind of dress rehearsal for the Boston Tea Party, which I think with just a little bit of different circumstances, the Boston Tea Party could very well have been the Boston Paper Party. In any case, the import of paper almost ceased after 1765, when the First Continental Congress imposed a systematic boycott on all imports from Britain, laying the foundation for the Second Colonial Congress to declare independence. The paper Jefferson used for drafting the Declaration of Independence, however, was imported from a Dutch windmill, probably via a British wholesaler. So the independence, paper independence, wasn't completely there yet. Now, so Franklin here, I describe him really as a media or proto-internet entrepreneur avant la lettre who understands the components of this new world of print, what it can lead to, and who tries to control all of it. You will have noticed that I have not yet mentioned Franklin's work as an author, and for good reasons. We now think of him primarily as one of the authors of the Declaration of Independence, but then as an author of the famous autobiography of Benjamin Franklin and his sort of self-help book for accumulating wealth. What's interesting is that Franklin never really thought of himself as an author and really, in many ways, wasn't an author. His book, Way to Wealth, was based on a column in a newspaper, Poor Richard's Almanac, which he wrote anonymously as Poor Richard's Almanac. And not only did he not present himself as an author, he really was more an editor because he used these sayings that he found all over the place. He really was more a kind of aggregator, we would say, and there are lots of later scholars who accused him of plagiarism, which is completely besides the point because he didn't present himself as the author of these sayings himself. He just collected them wherever he found them. Throughout most of his life, he didn't write for money. He really made his money with the print infrastructure and print media, not with his work as a single author. That was sort of an afterthought and came almost as an accident. And the same is true with his autobiography of Benjamin Franklin. Franklin never wrote a text called Autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, never published it in his lifetime. It's based on a letter that he wrote to his wayward son, and to the letter he later added other bits of narrative. But he, the printer, who controlled every aspect of print, who could have printed as many copies of this text as he would have wanted, never published any parts of it. So this is why I think I want to sort of shift the emphasis on Benjamin Franklin from the author of these classics to a kind of print entrepreneur. Franklin's life was so closely connected to print in all of its forms that he saw his life through print, or even as print. In his youth, he wrote a mock epitaph to be put on his gravestone. The epitaph reads, the body of B. Franklin, printer. Like the cover of an old book, its contents torn out and stripped of its lettering and gilding, lies here food for worms. But the work shall not be wholly lost, for it will, as he believed, appear once more in a new and more perfect edition, corrected and amended by the author. Now, while wittily referring to a godlike author in the afterlife, and as I mentioned, he had given up his belief in God, Franklin really describes his life from the perspective of a printer. It's true, I think, he was right that his life has been corrected and amended, not by a god, but by generations of biographers who've turned him into one of the most revered founding fathers. But I think we should respect his dying wish and remember him primarily as the person who brought the power of print to the struggle for independence. more simply, a Republican printer, as he liked to call himself. He was the printer of the Republic of Letters. Thank you. And I would be very happy to take questions or comments. Yes?
As for explanation about this Diamond Sutra,
Uh-huh.
that came from China,
Yes.
was that also movable types or was it carved as in the Sutra?
So that text, the Diamond Sutra, was woodcut, so not movable type, and that's an important distinction. Though there was movable type in China and especially in Korea before Gutenberg also. So even the technique of movable type existed in East Asia before Gutenberg. Now, we don't know exactly what Gutenberg knew himself. He lived in the city of Mainz, which was known for long-distance trade, so he certainly had ways of connecting to long-distance trade. And they were, what he saw around him in Northern Europe was mostly woodcut print. So it's possible that he really didn't know about East Asian print with movable type and that he genuinely reinvented it later independently. Or it's possible that he had heard about the technique somehow.
In China, was the movable type also woodcut?
No, you can't really use wood for movable, but it's too soft. They would use ceramics, but also some metal alloys in Korea. The other thing, of course, what made the technique of movable type so potent in Europe was the alphabet. Because, of course, you have many fewer letters and you can reuse them in a much more efficient way. Although Gutenberg, when he started to print the Bible, was surprised because, there are, 30 letters in the alphabet. Once he started to print that long book, he though realized that he, in the end, needed up to 300 different types for capital letters, for ligatures that are sort of combination of letters, and so on and so forth. So it's more complicated than it first sounded, but still, print with movable types was much more efficient, had much more of an advantage over wood carved for an alphabetic culture than for one like in China that was based on logographic characters. But so my point isn't so much to say Gutenberg imitated, just got the idea from someone else. I think he was a figure not unlike Franklin in that he was a real entrepreneur. He operated outside the guild system. He set up a secret company, and I think he recognized what could be done with print, and he revolutionized really the process by which print could be made. For example, he figured out a way of hand casting different letters so that process could be done really fast and with 300 letters, and they would wear out, and you would want to have several sets, so you could set several pages. That was a crucial process. He invented the press part of the printing press, because in East Asia you didn't need that form of pressure. And he used something that was abundant in the wine country around Mainz, namely a wine press. So he was really a kind of a genius figure, but much like someone like Steve Jobs, I think he wasn't sort of the original. It wasn't sort of this one original idea, but a very canny, creative imagination of what can be done and how this process can be completely perfected and turned into a completely kind of animal. And this is really, I think, what Gutenberg's contribution was. Yeah. Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for a wonderful lecture. I'm very curious, when you talk about the Arabic world, that you would mention as later 1001 Nights as the example that you would give for the potency of paper. Because when I think of the 1001 Nights, I think of them primarily as oral texts.
Yes.
Of course, because there was no print, so they were not fixed. But then one could think of the Quran, for example, that never really needed print and continue to be fixed over time, over centuries, utilize the power of paper as technology. Why would you choose, how would you justify why you chose that name?
I think precisely because of what you just said. So because the point of paper is that it lowers the cost of writing and therefore allows new people to participate in the world of reading and writing. And this then also leads to new kinds of stories that hitherto have existed only orally to make it into the world of print. It lowers the barrier, if you will. And in The 1001 Nights is a perfect example. It's a story collection. Many of the stories take place in a kind of merchant world, right, in the market. And this is precisely sort of a merchant class now is part of the world of print. And this is where these oral stories now take that hurdle of print. And as you said, they come from this oral culture and this network of storytelling. I became really fascinated by that because some of the stories in the 1001 Nights come from Indian story collections or Persian story collection, of course, is the model and even the name, or Greek Aesop's fable. So there is really this kind of Eurasian network of oral stories, but with the cost of literature now lowered, these new stories become part of literature. And the earliest paper fragment of the Arabic Nights is from a paper, is on paper. The Quran, unlike some of these other sacred texts that are early adopters, is not an early adopter of paper. There's a kind of resistance to it for a while, but then paper is accepted and there are beautiful calligraphic versions of the Quran written on paper after a while. But it's an interesting sort of almost an exception to the story about the Diamond Sutra and the Latin Bible and other examples where the canonical sacred texts become early adopters. In this case, there's this interesting kind of delay. But what happens is that there's always, so often the canonical texts become early adopters and there is this explosion of popular literature, and ultimately both of these things happen in the Arabic world. Yeah. Yes?
Yeah, thanks for a very stimulating lecture. Getting back to Ben Franklin, on the one hand, you mentioned that the major cities thrived, or the newspapers in major cities thrived on the debate and the plurality of opinion. And then we have Franklin, who's striving for vertical and horizontal control.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if you could just kind of riff a little bit on maybe the ideas that were marginalized and didn't get into common ideas on the history of the period.
So I'm glad you asked because it's actually fascinating. So when I say that Franklin recognized that it's the controversy that makes this thing run, he really did. And so he tried not to control the content. And people actually attacked him, especially once he sided with the revolutionary sides and against the loyalists. But he would print both aspects in his newspaper. So because he realized that if he were to shut it down, the competition would just pop up and publish these ideas. So he took a very Catholic approach to this and tried not to wield his power to control content because he realized that it would actually weaken his hand. So, and as I said, people were upset about that. And I think it's, again, it speaks to this shift in emphasis I'm trying to make between Franklin himself, an author, himself as someone with strong opinions and polemical opinions that wants to push these opinions in the public domain. But I think as a media entrepreneur, he actually did a pretty good job not interfering with the content too much. Now, there may be some opinions that he didn't like. Actually, there is one good example. It has to do actually with a failure. So in Pennsylvania, there's a large German-speaking population. Actually, the majority at the time spoke German. So he tried to break into the German-speaking newspaper market. And he failed, in part because the German readers liked the Gothic type, and so the Roman type didn't fly with them. Then he imports Gothic type, and he makes a second attempt, but he fails again. And I think one reason was that in this case he actually tried to control the content, because many of the German speakers were Quakers, so they were extreme pacifists. And Franklin didn't like that. He considered that a kind of betrayal. So he actually was kind of tone deaf to that particular clientele, and this is why these were some of the rare ventures in which he failed. And my guess is, although I don't remember him writing about it in letters, so he may have, that he learned from that experience. Yeah. Yes.
Thanks a lot. I have a question about the Quran. I have another question about Franklin in a minute. You said that it could have been printed on paper, but it chose not to. Unlike other sacred texts, you said
Yes.
it was not one of the adopters of paper, which, if I understand it correctly, was already in existence.
Right. Correct.
So what was it printed on? And how was it disseminated?
Yeah.
Do you know a little bit about the history of the Quran?
Yeah, so it was not printed, I should say the first thing, so because that's
It was
written, handwritten.
Right.
It was written on parchment, for the most part, yes, and often, dusted with gold, very beautiful, and that was the most valuable and durable material. There were probably also papyrus versions. That was the other material, available.
It's the durability of the material that was considered more important than the currency or the greater availability of some other material.
That's right. So parchment is much more expensive to produce than paper, though, and more durable. Though paper, especially expensive paper, is smoother, more easily. It can be more elegant. I have a chapter about Japan and the tale of Genji, which I think is sort of the pinnacle of refined Japanese paper culture. So they are appealing. Paper is not just cheap, I guess is what I'm saying, but can be also a wonderful material. But paper existed for, I think the earliest paper versions of the Quran are from the late 12th, 13th century, and that this would have been several hundred years after the introduction of paper to the Arabic world.
So obviously by design and by intention.
Exactly. And so there's a certain, so even though sometimes the sacred texts are early adopters, there's also sometimes a kind of conservatism with respect to new technologies, and that makes sense because here we're dealing with sacred scripture. And the sacred scripture is often then attached to a particular technology or format. Another good example, I like to think of it as one of the first format wars. So I have a chapter about the Hebrew Bible and how that's one of the first texts that around which the idea of sacred scripture is established, that then spreads to other parts of the world. Now, the format of the Hebrew Bible is the papyrus scroll. This is how Ezra holds up, in the book of Ezra, holds up the scrolls and demands that the people worship this text as if it were a god. That's sort of, for me, sort of the scene that captures that. So now we have Jesus coming along, and of course Jesus doesn't write a single word, like Muhammad, like the Buddha, like Confucius, and I have a chapter about that interesting pattern of these kind of writing skeptics, if you will, but their followers and students produce these texts around these charismatic teachers. But the status of these texts is very different. In the case of the followers of Jesus, they just want to write, they don't think they're producing new scripture, they're just producing kind of memory notes of the life and sayings of their dead teacher. And for that they use a new format, a Roman format, a very low Roman format, namely the codex, what we call the book. The book is not a high status form, it's what you use for everyday correspondence and take notes. And this is what they use, but that becomes the format of what we now call the New Testament. So you have, and for this new Roman codex, a parchment is especially good because it's durable and you can use flip through pages. So you have, if you will, a format war between the Jewish papyrus scroll and the Christian parchment codex. And there's right in the very format of the text used, you have this kind of bifurcation of Christianity and Judaism, which, as you know, at this moment, it's not clear that there's something that we will call Christianity would emerge, but it's visible, I think, from the beginning in this format. So yes, there are always interesting questions. So the Hebrew scrolls used to this day in service, it never gets transferred to these more modern technologies. And I think in the case of the Quran, there's a similar, initially at least, a similar conservatism. Let's stick to the material on which this sacred text was always written. And then after an initial hesitation, does this newcomer, this cheap material, namely paper, which gets more and more refined, gets used for the Quran as well. Yeah. Yes, in the back.
This kind of taboo that connects the environment with a certain form of purity and prerequisite
right,
for basically
right.
touching.
Yeah. It's yes, you would think so, and it may well have been the reason in the case of the Quran. What's interesting, and you would expect it also in the case of Gutenberg, right? So here is this smith, this goldsmith, who is proposing to replace devoted monks for whom copying the sacred texts is their devotional service. And they spent their lives doing it. And here comes Gutenberg and is proposing to replace these wonderful high prestige monks with a wine press. You think that the Catholic Church would scream. What's interesting is that it doesn't. And it doesn't, I think, for two reasons. A, it of course means that they can print their Bibles more cheaply and distribute it more widely to monasteries and churches. It also, more important, it solves another problem. People had gotten very worried about the fact that Catholic service was not preached in the same way in two different churches because of scribal errors. So generations of scribes introduce more and more errors into any given handwritten Bible. So this created almost a kind of theological crisis. And the church realized that there would be printer errors, but there wouldn't be this generation of errors. So that, in fact, print suddenly seemed a good way of exerting much more control over the sacred text. And that seemed to the church a real plus. And it looked much more beautiful, much more even than even the best scribe could do. So the church, initially, in this kind of, in retrospect, ironic, the church loves print. Of course, what the church doesn't realize, that print lowers the cost of literature, leads to new entrants in the market, makes Luther comes along, translates the Bible into German, Tyndale comes along, translates the Bible into English, into the language of the people. They get printed Bibles, and the church loses control over its text, and you have the beginning of the Protestant Revolution. But, they couldn't look into the future. What they saw for 60 years, the church was the primary client for Gutenberg. And, even more ironic, the other thing, what Gutenberg prints, before he prints the Latin Bible, is indulgences. So, indulgences are great for print. It's just one page in Latin, and you leave the name blank. You fill that in later, and it's like printing money. And they printed a single indulgence, hundreds, thousands, even tens of thousands. There's one, I think, where they printed 100,000 copies of a single indulgence, and then it's great. But it was too great because, of course, it drove people like Martin Luther insane. So they kind of dug their own grave with print, or by embracing it, they first thought they they would control the Bible even more. And they did for about 60 years. But then it all changed. So yeah, it's interesting that these technologies often look one way and then they have this other effect, or the stool effect that I keep describing also with the Diamond Sutra. The most canonical established texts, it makes sense, are in the best. They already dominate, if you will, the market for printed matter, so they are in a good position to profit from this new technology. But then there is this popular democratizing effect that always kicks in and really shifts the ground. And I think we're experiencing the same today.
What I meant is specifically related to the idea of
Purity.
purity.
Well,
If one is not pure in relation basically to the right rituals of bodily purification,
Yeah.
women,
Yeah.
and then actually abortions and stuff like that.
Yeah.
This is something that actually would somehow
yeah.
become problematic.
Yes, you would think.
Making it a
You would think, you know, if I think if it had been the case that the church would have taken Gutenberg and burned him on the stake for trying to print without permission, he didn't ask anyone for permission, the Latin Bible, we would have nodded our heads and made exactly the argument you just made. It's interesting, and I agree, surprising that didn't happen, and that the church, I don't know whether there were debates in this direction, but somehow the advantages seem to prevail, and the limited advantages for about 60 years. So yeah, you know.
Yes. You made some passing references to 18th century culture of encyclopedias, but of course we think of 18th century, we think encyclopedias, we tend to think of France, encyclopedia,
Yes.
Nero down
Yeah.
all their scribes. But in the 13 colonies, did Franklin or any of his associates ever attempt to launch or get going kind of a homegrown encyclopedia?
They didn't, but there was, so the French encyclopédie was actually started as a translation of an English cyclopedia or a universal dictionary of the arts and sciences.
Chalmers or Chambers or something?
Excuse me?
There was a Chalmers or a Chambers?
Exactly, and so that was just a 2-volume, and the French started to translate it, but then in the process of translation, they started to add, and out of this 2-volume, they created this huge thing. Now, what's interesting is that the Pennsylvania Gazette that Franklin bought out after he had sort of established himself in Philadelphia actually had started to print excerpts from that English cyclopedia on which the French encyclopedia was based, and start in every issue there would be something from that encyclopedia. Franklin comes along and he loves encyclopedias, but he realizes that it's actually a bad idea because he calculates that it would take like 15 years for the entire encyclopedia to run in newspapers, and also that's kind of defeats the point of an encyclopedia because you want to cross-reference and flip back and forth. To have it in individually in newspapers doesn't make sense. So he actually stops it and explains that it doesn't make that the encyclopedia you need a full set, and that's how it works. So he gets rid of it from his newspaper, but not because he doesn't like it, but I think because he understands what's involved in an encyclopedia. At that time, there is no homegrown. Again, there's no international copyright, so you can just import the stuff from England and pirate it. And this is basically what American print is like till the late 19th century, when the International Geneva Convention went into it.
The problems you mentioned, Frank, I just made, those are exactly the things that you could all much to his grief ran into.
Yes, exactly. Right, exactly.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thanks again. 2 questions. First, I seem to recall from my grammar school history lesson that one of the keys for printing incidents related to the American Revolution was common sense.
Yes.
Thomas Paine, and it's reading patterns, and I wonder if there's
Right.
a relationship between that and,
Yeah.
and Benjamin Franklin's project. The other is, I recall seeing an interview with Jeff Bezos, the lead of a couple of centuries, shortly after Stephen King launched a novel online for the first time.
Yes.
It was a flop.
Yes.
And this was a sort of stunning moment because there was a belief that the internet would
Yeah.
allow literature to be disseminated, and when that happened, everybody took a step back. And according to Bezos, what he did was hire literary scholars, designers, whatever, and what he said in this interview, which I found fascinating, was that what they told him was that the medium of paper and with ink on it allowed the consumer to actually read without being conscious of the format in which it was read. And that was impossible with the existing digital technology. So it's a long-winded way of asking, do you think we're in a moment that is a difference in degree, or is it a difference in kind? Have we, somehow entered the, post-paper period, which may take a while and whatever?
Thanks for both. The first, yes, so Franklin helped Paine publish his pamphlet and advised him on it. Paine did something really canny. He renounced all copyright so that anyone could just, within the colonies, anyone could republish it. Paine, with Franklin's help, used this pamphlet system really, really well. And it didn't primarily run on Franklin's. By that point, Franklin had more or less, withdrawn from the kind of day-to-day business. But Paine asked him for advice on common sense. And I don't know whether it was Franklin who recommended that he just renounce all copyright, but that's what he did, and that's what helped, get this text reprinted everywhere really fast. On the paper and consumers, it's interesting that early King experiment that fails. I was just before coming here, I was in India, including at the Jaipur Literary Festival, where Marcus Dole, the CEO of Penguin Random House, and owned by Bertelsmann, said that with all the, everywhere what we produce now is content, and the price of content is falling very rapidly. Whether that's music or movies, any content is the journalism. That actually books is sort of an exception. That he felt very confident that publishers had actually figured out, or that consumers were willing to spend good money on digital books, and that was kind of surprising and kind of the exception in the whole electronic realm, which is very interesting. And I don't know whether it is connected to the fact that books also, it seems also to have stabilized. I think about 20 to 30% of books are e-books. Fiction, especially light fiction, it's much higher. Non-fiction and sort of serious literary fiction, I think, lower. So there's more paper, reading in paper. But there's something in the current environment where on the one hand, consumers are willing to pay for e-content in the form of books. But there's also still a pretty stable print paper component. I'm not sure I'm really answering your question about paper.
Actually, the paradox seemed to me, and it Bezos seemed to have caught on. It's a very odd answer they gave him after a year. He got all these people together, but they went electronically reproduced paper and ink.
Right.
And that is where the Kindle comes from.
Right.
The Kindle
Exactly.
comes from electronically
paper.
reproducing
Right.
paper and ink, and then they'll forget about the medium.
Oh, I see. Now I get you. Yeah. It's true. It looks like paper. No, I remember in the early '90s when I was a student at Harvard, a friend who knew people at MIT took me to the startup. and they were one of the first to work on e-paper. And I was thinking, e-paper, what's that? That's not important. That was wrong. Yeah, but it's interesting how long it actually took for e-paper to, so these people were starting in the early 90s, and it took the better part of over almost 2 decades, so 15 years for e-paper to really emerge. Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting.
Shall we? Okay. Any other questions?
Can I just add a brief one? Back in one more.
And I'll answer it very briefly.
The stamps. Was because you said he was involved in the postal roads and he was a printer, was he also involved in making postage stamps?
Postage stamps. I don't know that I'm not sure about that.
Was a Stamp Act a press that you pushed down?
Yeah, so you basically, yes, it was. It wasn't like a physical stamp. It's something that's part of the paper.
Like a watermark?
Yeah, exactly. No. Thank you all.
Thank you all.